Hi, and thanks for joining me today. One of the things that is common in a funeral and in the time following a funeral is people get together and retell some of the stories of their memories of the deceased. And if you've ever had to do a eulogy or put a program together where you're going to be retelling some of these stories, maybe you're like me and I thought it would have been really nice if they had done a story of their lives, perhaps if you didn't know them very well. If they had done a biography of sorts, recounting the basic events of their lives, especially maybe some of those early events that others may not know about. But also to reflect on what you've observed or they have observed and what they have learned as they went through life. And I think that would be beneficial both for the person doing it and for others who then would later read it. Now, as we closed out Genesis, we saw Joseph as a man who had suffered greatly, in at least in certain ways, for many years. Yet what we saw about Joseph is he wasn't the kind of guy that would hang on to blame. He didn't sort of play the victim. But what we saw is that he liked to give credit to God for what God has accomplished, that he had more interest in God's agenda than playing the victim, than sort of regurgitating or just sort of focusing on how others had treated him in wrong ways. Instead, he embraced agency for his own life. Then we go to Exodus, and Exodus begins with identifying the family of Israel and how God had used that setting in Egypt for a great increase in population, right? His promise was he was going to make them into a great nation, and this had been part of the plan. Otherwise, they would probably cease to exist during that time of famine. At the same time, though, what has now happened is that the political environment was no longer favorable for the Hebrew people. And in fact, it had become and transitioned to just the opposite. And so in Exodus 2, we'd get this historical timeline, if you will, of about 2/3 of this fellow by the name of Moses that we get to meet, right? About 2/3 of his life we get to read about in Exodus 2, about close to 80 years. And his life, of course, was almost over before it even started, because there was that death sentence and all the baby Hebrew boys. However, we see his parents take steps to try to keep him alive. God honors that intent in a very profound way. The result is he is raised in a protected environment in his early years where he gets to have that opportunity to form an attachment with his parents. He gets to form that identity as a Hebrew, which also involved worshiping the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Then, of course, later on, we do know that he is moved to the home of Pharaoh's daughter, a place of privilege in many ways, and certainly one of education. And at approximately 40 years of age, Moses ventures forth and he seeks to set things right between an Egyptian who was mistreating a Hebrew. That led to murder and ultimately Moses being a marked man on the run rather than being a hero or a savior. And after crossing a dry wilderness and desert area, both physically and emotionally, Moses develops a new life. He finds a wife, he has a child, he has an extended family to be part of. He establishes a career, if you will, of being a sheep herder, a career that was certainly not liked. It was despised by the Egyptians, but it was in line with his heritage. Certainly wasn't the easy and the privileged life of the son of the Pharaoh's daughter, but it was what he had, and he made a life out of it. And it wasn't necessarily easy. He was certainly active in recognizing that at the age that he went into it, there's a lot of alone time, all kinds of weather. He cared for sick animals as well as protecting the herds from wild animals. He wasn't getting rich. It wasn't probably the life that he had anticipated growing up. But he did make a life of it, and he had settled down, and he made this life among people that weren't his own. And it's really, these are the stories, and these are the experiences we often talk about at funerals, and some of the memories we have. Really, they're not bad things, right? It's about growing up, it's about getting a career, it's about establishing relationship and family, and getting a place to live and a reason to get up in the morning, and the general sort of that general making of our way through life. And then we get to chapter 3. And in chapter 3, 1-6, we read, "Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I'll go over there and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. We read that Moses is doing his job as a herdsman. It was just another day. He led the flock to the west side of the wilderness, and he came to Horeb, described as the mountain of God. He's going about his life, nothing famous, just the ordinary, perhaps difficult, alone. He's been living now for decades without contact with his biological and adoptive family. Nothing at all like the life of Pharaoh's daughter's son, or things that he anticipated. All the education might have seemed like a waste. The animals didn't care. And we read that Moses is in this area herding the animals. And Horeb, which is also called Mount Sinai, has a spiritual significance. It's the idea was sort of, the picture was that the heavens are in the air and the earth is where we are, and where the two touch or sort of come into contact, like we see in a mountaintop, can be a place of spiritual significance, a place where heaven and earth touch, so to speak. And it's in this area where the supernatural, the divine, make an appearance in the flames of a fire within a bush. Now this catches Moses' eye, particularly not only because the bush is on fire, which would be important to be aware of, especially in a dry place, but because the bush isn't burning up. And Moses is intrigued and he's interested and he goes over to investigate. What's this all about? What's going on? And have you ever noticed that the things that interest you, you didn't choose them? You didn't just wake up one morning and go, I'm going to be interested in this. It's sort of intrinsic to us. And Moses is following his interest. And so he goes over. And when he follows his interest, and God reveals himself to Moses in the bush. So he follows something that attracts him. And this is the place that God, you might say, makes connection with him. This is where God reveals himself. When Moses gives his attention to his interest, he finds God calling his name, Moses, Moses. And appropriately, Moses says, Here I am, right? It's not, what do you want? Or what do you want me to do? It's here I am. I'm here. I'm present. I'm listening. And God calls his name. It's personal. And Moses responds appropriately. Have you ever heard God call your name? God speak to you? Have you wondered how to respond? How did you respond? Have you responded to God's call to come into relationship with him? And so what we see is this call is relational. And why is that important? Because I think that is what God wants most. He wants you. Not just what you can do. Unfortunately, a lot of people seem to treat us as sort of what they can get from us is the way people often will treat us. But God isn't like that. What he wants is us, number one. The other stuff, he can get done any other way if he wants to. Should he want to do it whatever way. But he wants you, and he wants your presence, your attention, your commitment, your love. And we see that God then gives Moses, he interacts in this relational way. God gives Moses instruction on how to be in God's presence. And how do we approach God? How do we continue the conversation so it just doesn't stop there? How do we continue that conversation? Well, what we see is that God says you're on holy ground. Okay, so you want to be really paying attention to this. This is holy ground. So how do we do this? And it wasn't because there was some kind of, magical special place necessarily. It's that God had set this time and place aside to reveal himself to Moses. And so when that happens, right, we want to pay attention. And he says, you're on holy ground, take off your sandals. Why? Of course, in our culture, many of us will remove our shoes before we walk through someone's house as a sign of respect. As men, we might remove our hats when the national anthem is played, to show respect. What we see in that culture was that even with the Egyptian high priests in their temple and in other cultures, Jamieson, Fawcett, and Brown commentary talks about this. He says that this was a common thing, that when you came into the temple, you removed your shoes, your sandals, if you will. And what was that? It was the removal of the shoes, right? When you walk, we know that if you take your shoes off, you're on the ground, you walk sort of carefully. You got shoes on, you can just sort of crash through. But here what they had was this removal of shoes. It was a confession of personal defilement and conscious unworthiness to stand in the presence of unspotted holiness. So what God is calling Moses to do is to recognize in a way that was culturally understood where he was at and where God is. I think when we come into contact with God, this is what we will recognize, right? When you come into the presence of great light, you see any darkness, you see any dirt, you see any flaws. When you come with something that's pure, you see impurity in yourself. And so we see that Moses is called to come before God with respect and humility and reverence and care, but also to have a recognition that they aren't equals, God and him. He comes with a recognition of his own shortcomings and his sinfulness. And it's in this place, right, of his own unworthiness that then God reveals himself. He said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Right? I am the God you grew up hearing about. I am the God who made the covenant with the Hebrew people, the agreement. And the agreement is still in place. And though you are far from your people, right? Decades from contact, I have not forgotten my people. I have not forgotten you. And so what was Moses' response in all of this? It says he hid his face because he was afraid to look at God, right? There was a sense of reverence and respect and fear and recognition of his own unworthiness and unholiness, that this isn't a God that you try to manipulate through spells or special memorized prayers or commands or somehow like you can just sort of make him do what you want. No. It was a place of humility and respect and honor, right? God was holy, and he was not worthy of this God who was graciously had contacted him. And I think that's what happens as we get into contact with God, right? We recognize our own shortcomings and lack. And I guess we need to have a sense of, it'll be uncomfortable, but at the same time, a recognition that this is who I am, but it's the grace and the mercy of God that is demonstrated greatest in places like this. It's not somehow I deserve it. And then in verse 7, God goes on to identify and explain his heart and his agenda, right? He says, so he's identified who he is, and the conversation sort of continues, right? It continues, and he says, this is what's been on my heart. This is what I'm planning. I've seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of the slave drivers. I'm concerned about their suffering, God says. And as a result, I have a plan to rescue them. I want to rescue them from their oppressors and to bring them to a land that is described as a good and spacious land, like this great space, a land flowing with milk and honey, a place of agriculture that is rich and abundant. And God says, I'm taking action, and I am choosing you, Moses, to be part of my plan for this rescue operation. And God tells him that he's sending him back to the land where he grew up, back to the place that he had fled, back where he's going to have to face his fears, his memories, his failures, to go back to the place, you might say, to attend to a project that 40 years ago he had attempted on his own. And now he's sent back to address the inequities of how his people were being treated. And Moses' response is no longer sort of that confident man of 40 years ago. Rather, it's, who am I to do this? Right? No longer interested in being the hero. No longer so confident in his upbringing and status. Right? That status, fame, position, long gone. He's much older. Right? He's around 80. He's no longer confident in some of the things that he had put so much weight in before. And he's seemingly shocked that God would suggest such a mission. Who am I to do this? Right? I'm a sheep herder out in the wilderness. He's feeling inadequate. Who is going to listen to me? The self-doubt is obvious. And God's response is not, you've got it, or I believe in you. Rather, it was, I will be with you. Right? This isn't about your abilities in the past or in the present so much as it is, I will be with you. This isn't about you. This is about me enabling you to do what I call you to do. And in order to confirm that I have sent you on a God-ordained mission, I will give you a sign that you have brought the fact that it is I who have sent you to bring the people out of Egypt, that you will worship God on this mountain, that you will come back to this very place one day with the people. You're the leader. The people are following you, and you will come back to this very place where we've had this conversation, and you will worship me on this mountain. Then you will know, right? It is I you have met and had this conversation with and have sent you and made this happen. And so Moses tries again. In verses 13 to 15, he says, Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. And God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. What is God's name? Which is linked with what is God's character? Who is God? Right? Big questions. What is your name? Right? It was very significant in that culture. I am what I am, or I will be what I will be. It's believed there's a play on words that's connected to what we translate as Yahweh, or if you're a King James Bible reader, it would say Jehovah, or other translations, it's translated as Lord in capitals. This sense of God's self-existence, his eternal and unchanging nature, being the same yesterday, today, and forever. That, right, you can't just put him in a little box. There's sort of a sense of incomprehensible, being sort of incomprehensible to some degree. That he's faithful, true to his promises, unchanging, right? There's none like him. I heard someone, and I wish I could remember to give credit, but he has written his thesis on this and had carried the idea that not necessarily just sort of explaining, but it was sort of opening up this invitation, well, come along and see who I am. And that Exodus, as we read Exodus, God will reveal who he is in sort of a continuing fashion throughout Exodus, that we will learn. So be curious, and I will teach you more about who I am. Matthew Henry, in his commentary, writes, Moses must revive among them the religion of their fathers, which was almost lost, and then they might expect the speedy performance of the promises made unto their fathers. And so what he's suggesting too is that there needs to be revival, a renewal of faith. And so God goes on to tell Moses what he's to do and to say, and he tells them this. He says, the elders of Israel will listen, but the king of Egypt will not. And he says, what I want you to do is I want you to go tell the king of Egypt that you want the people, that basically this is God's idea, right? They are to go a 3 days journey into the wilderness, right, to worship God, to make sacrifices to the Lord. And what that is about is maybe more than it, I think it's more than it appears. See, the king saw the Israelites, the Hebrew people, as his subjects, as his slaves. And here in this request, God is saying, no, they're my subjects and they are to come worship me. Not you, me. God is claiming ownership, which of course will be directly against what the king of Egypt holds dear. And so what we have is a showdown is coming. And God tells him this is what he's to do. God also lets Moses know the end result of the showdown. Really nice. We don't know, God doesn't always tell us. He just walks step by step. But here God lets Moses know the end of the result of the showdown is that the king's going to say no, but as a result of wonders that God will perform, the Hebrew people will at some point be allowed to go. But in fact, they're not going to just sort of run away. They're going to leave as the conquering people. That is, they will leave with plunder. That is, before they leave, when their time is to go, they are instructed to go ask the Egyptians for silver and gold and clothing. They will be given things, silver, gold, and clothing, as they leave. They will not escape, you might say, by the skin of your teeth, the skin of their teeth, but they will leave like a conquering nation with plunder, if you will, gained from those that lost the battle. I don't know what your image of God is and what your internal understanding of God is. Do you see yourself as one who serves God, a subject to God, who God has interest in, cares for and protects? Have you put God number one and focused and putting your attention and focus into that relationship? I would encourage you to do so if you haven't, and see what God will then communicate and how he'll reveal himself to you. Thanks for listening. And next week we'll continue on with more from Exodus. Thanks for listening.